Hi, boys and girls. So last week you learned about the geography of ancient Greece, which dealt with the climate in ancient Greece and how ancient Greece used to have city-states and overall how ancient Greece used to look back in that time period. So this week you are going to learn about the culture of ancient Greece. And this middle bubble says ancient Greece culture. So you are mainly going to be learning about the way the ancient Greeks lived and the traditions that they had. So at the bottom of this circle there's a picture, and you may be familiar with this picture. These are the Olympic rings, and the reason the picture is here is because the first Olympic Games actually took place in ancient Greece, and you will learn more about that as we go through this presentation. So the first thing we are going to talk about is language. The ancient Greeks were the first Europeans to read and write with an alphabet. So this is pretty cool and unique. And down here there's a picture of the alphabet that they used. You may be familiar with some of these letters, like A is alpha, E is epsilon, delta is D. So you may already know some of these letters, but the ancient Greeks are the ones who created the first alphabet. Clothing. Ancient Greek clothing was homemade. The fabrics of the clothing were intensely colored and decorated with designs. Clothing for women and men consisted of two main garments, a tunic and a cloak. So imagine that you only had these two main pieces of clothing to wear, because that's what the ancient Greeks wore back in their time. And for footwear, women and men wore sandals, slippers, soft shoes, or boots. And at home, they almost always went barefoot. Everyday life. Men were usually training in the military or discussing politics. On their time off, men went to the theater for entertainment. Shows at the theater often involved current politics and gods in some form. Women were not allowed to watch shows in the theater or perform at the theater. So therefore, male actors played women roles. So if there was a woman character in a certain play or show that they were putting on at the theater, the male had to become that woman, because women were not allowed to be in the shows. Instead, they did domestic work, spinning and weaving. They were not involved in public life or in politics, and they were normally confined to the house. So women really weren't supposed to leave the house. They were supposed to stay and do chores like spinning and weaving and cooking, and they really weren't involved in the politics or the public life outside of the house. And boys were trained in the military starting at the age of 7. So imagine being in first or second grade and being trained to go into the military. That's a really young age to learn all of those techniques. And girls were arranged to get married at the age of 13, which is also really young for them to get married. I believe 13 is the age of middle school, and I don't think that girls at that age are quite ready to get married. So that's a very young age to be arranging marriage. Farming. Since the Greek landscape and climate were difficult to farm in, citizens often had land outside the cities. Grapes were usually picked and kept for eating or made into wine. Olives were picked by hand or knocked out of the trees with wooden sticks. Some olives were crushed to produce olive oil. This was an important product to the Greeks because it had many uses, which include cooking, lighting, beauty products, and for athletic purposes. And I'm sure if you have ever eaten Greek food, you know that olives and olive oil and grapes are a main part of a Greek meal. Food. Ancient Greeks usually ate bread, which was barley or wheat, and porridge with foods such as cheese, vegetables, fish, eggs, and fruit. Animals such as deer, hare, and boars were hunted, only as an addition to their food supply. And honey was the only sweetening that existed at that time. So there was no sugar or other sweeteners, it was just honey. Ancient Greek games. Now this is what I was talking about in the beginning with the picture of the Olympic rings. So the Olympic Games first started here in Greece. Greek boys played games like hockey, but hockey was not part of the Olympic Games. The ancient Greek boys usually played games naked, so girls were not allowed to play with them. Ancient Greek women and girls were not expected to do any physical activity for recreation purposes. So going back to what we talked about before, the women really weren't allowed to do activities outside of the house, especially physical activities. They were mainly inside, taking care of the chores that they had to do inside the home. And the ancient Greeks also played games that did not involve much physical activity, such as marbles, dice, and checkers. And their version of checkers involved a board, stones, and dice, which is very different from checkers nowadays, which just involves a board and those red and black pieces. So that is the gist of the ancient Greece culture, and you are going to watch a video on the Olympic Games and how it all got started.